in our series of 3 webinars under the banner title Understanding Biodiversity in the Planning System. For those of you who weren't on the first webinar, this series has been created specifically for planners and planning committee members, so those charged with ensuring that biodiversity is protected and enhanced within the development planning system. Thriving biodiversity, or nature, is fundamental to human health and well-being and is rightly protected by legislation and policy here in the UK. If you're a planner or a planning committee member, you may be wondering why a professional body for ecologists and environmental managers is providing free webinars for planners. The answer is that you have a critically important role in the implementation of legislation and planning policy designed to protect and enhance biodiversity. You are the checks and balances that ensure the law is not broken, that policies designed to prevent further loss of biodiversity through development are adhered to, and that development can be designed in such a way that biodiversity thrives. Helping you understand your role and responsibilities, what standard of information advice you can expect from ecologists, and what help there is out there to aid you, is our way of helping you in your role. We will ask for feedback after each webinar, but at the conclusion of the series of 3, we would welcome feedback as to further support we can offer, including more in-depth training on any particular topic. The webinars are being presented by Alan Evans of the Environmental Partnership. The second webinar is entitled The Information That Planners Need. The third webinar, which will be presented in September, is on knowing when ecological reports are fit for purpose, and we do hope that you'll be able to join us for that one as well. So over to you, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much, Sally. Good morning, everyone. Well, just about morning, isn't it? So yeah, this morning we're looking at taking account of biodiversity and the information that planners or planning needs with relation to ecological and biodiversity matters. And we'll look through the process really from pre-application discussions and validation, the types and format of ecological information required, when are ecological surveys required to meet statutory requirements, and the level of information required to ensure legal compliance with the duties that local planning authorities have. So obviously, local planning authorities have a statutory duty to consider the conservation, protection, enhancement of biodiversity when determining planning applications. So in this case, we've got a slow worm in someone's greenhouse, a garden, where a development is looking for an infill plot. So obviously, the impacts on that species need to be considered. Having the right level of information is important to both assess the impacts on international, national, local sites, priority habitats and species, and protected species, and also to influence and inform statutory processes such as environmental impact assessment, and with regards to SACs and SPAs and Rambler sites when you're undertaking habitat regs assessments or appraisals in Scotland. So starting at the beginning of a project for some people, the actual pre-application stage can be very important. It's the opportunity for the decision maker, i.e. the planning authority, the applicant, and the statutory consultees to consider the site, its context, potential impacts, and the range of ecological surveys that are going to be required to support the application. Also consider whether the application is of a type or in a sensitive location to trigger the need for environmental impact assessment. As I said earlier, also opportunity for input from the statutory agencies. Obviously, for some applicants, it may be through the increasingly paid process of discretionary advice service that operates in Natural England, the Environment Agency, and I understand also applies to Natural Resources Wales for some of their remit as well. It's also to consider sort of the wider impacts of a proposed development in terms of the landscape, both in terms of the ecological networks, the green infrastructure, what likely mitigation and compensation measures are required, and with the drive to biodiversity net gain as a policy stance across all the devolved administrations, what elements can be incorporated to add to the development in terms of biodiversity. And the biodiversity duties that planning authorities have starts very much at validation, and the need to validate the application, ensure that the biodiversity and geological issues have been addressed by the applicant. And this does vary throughout devolved administrations and local planning authorities. Obviously, there's no mandatory requirement to submit ecological information, but in some planning authorities there are local lists. So here we are, an Essex example with a very distinctive list of what's required for certain types of development. In other authorities, they might have supplementary planning documents or supplementary planning guidance with advisories on the nature and scale of surveys, or they might have some informal guidance notes or sort of in-house advice that they provide to applicants. Just using the Flintshire example where I live, they've got a supplementary planning guidance note on nature conservation and development, within which it states when a nature appraisal is required, which covers the usual conversion of buildings, impacts on habitat types, construction information, etc. This triggers the need to supply that relevant information with the application. Also, the importance of having this relevant ecological information provides greater certainty and clarity for both the planning authority, its consultees, and those communities who are going to be impacted by the proposed development. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes not so. But providing it up front and get that early engagement should hopefully make the whole process more efficient. And not providing information can obviously cause a delay in the decision-making process, especially if you're going to allow for additional protected species surveys, which need to be done at certain times of the year. And if the applicant doesn't provide that information, it could be a reason for refusing the application. Turning to survey and report types, we'll start off with the preliminary ecological appraisals. And hopefully, Christy, you can do a quick poll on this in terms of how many of you actually heard of preliminary ecological appraisals. So yeah, here comes the poll. Give a quick yes, no answer to that. And this is pretty much a rapid assessment of the ecological features on and potential for within the site and its sort of zone of influence around it. Oh, we've got the feedback already. So yeah, fairly good response in terms of how many people are aware of preliminary ecological appraisals, 84%. And these comprise two elements, a desk study and a walkover, field survey. And this is well documented in the guidelines that CIEEM have produced for preliminary ecological appraisals. In terms of the actual desk study, obviously to start off with actually looking at the site context, aerial photos, maps, etc. And then designated site information, species records, this can come from the local record centre or local groups, actually badger groups, and then the supporting habitat information that's available. I mean, a lot of this now is increasingly available online. Obviously in England, you've got Magic. In Scotland, they've provided all their national vegetation classification information online, which is very useful. And certainly for Wales. I'm not sure about Northern Ireland, but I'm sure they have something similar. That obviously is useful background information to both identify sites, which need to be, are there any impacts on those, obviously the potential for any species that may be present on or adjacent to the site. The second part is actually getting into the field and undertaking that extended phase 1 habitat survey, which is pretty much along the lines of the JNCC phase 1 handbook. Looking at the plant composition and the evidence of site management. And the output usually a plan with target notes or features of ecological interest. And also will assess the conservation value of those habitats and features. In particular, can they actually support any other protected or priority species? So preliminary ecological appraisals are very good for sort of giving you that initial overview. What are the likely ecological constraints for the project? Any potential mitigation requirements, following the mitigation hierarchy, identifying when further surveys are required to inform a more detailed analysis through an ecological impact assessment. Also, we'll flag up potential opportunities for biodiversity enhancement. For instance, if there's a hedge that's now gappy, there could be opportunities to plant up the gaps in that to provide that enhancement on the site. The preliminary ecological appraisals and the report, actual pair, should we say, is usually used where the project design is not fixed. It can be used for scale of development, and the information could be presented in ecological constraints and opportunities plan, which highlights these constraints and opportunities. But they're generally not appropriate to submit with planning applications on their own. But when these PAs are undertaken, there's usually no detailed proposals. There's no detailed ecological assessment of the impacts to consider, and will flag up the need for further surveys. So usually you might get the PAR submitted with a further batch of surveys, but probably unlikely that you'll get one of these standalone. I mean, there could be a few examples when you would accept this as a standalone report. We can clearly see there's no identified impact on biodiversity, no further surveys are required, or precautionary mitigation can be applied. So you might have an area of just scrub or young trees in the corner site, maybe with not significant ecological value, with potential of breeding birds. Obviously, therefore, the application of breeding bird condition would be appropriate. Taking that initial information from the PA, there's now a more detailed analysis of the actual impacts of a proposal through the ecological impact assessment. These are a very thorough examination of the impacts, particularly those of significant impacts. So it's a process of identifying, quantifying, and evaluating potential effects of development on both habitat species and the ecosystems. And again, CIEEM has produced detailed guidelines on this process. It can be used as standalone to demonstrate how a project accords with legislation and policy, or could actually form a component part of the actual environmental impact assessment for those more significant projects, i.e. be it chapter with an environmental statement. Obviously, the ecological impact assessment is a very thorough analysis, and it can be quite detailed. For those smaller scale developments, which might be householder application, barn conversions, application for land up to about a hectare. More commonly seen surveys are the extended phase 1 habitat surveys. You might still have the preliminary ecological appraisal, but attached to that, you might have further protected species surveys regarding impacts on bats or newts within that site. And that may also be wrapped up in an ecological assessment, actually looking at what's on the site, what the impacts are, and what measures are going to be put in place to actually address those impacts, and also to identify opportunities for enhancement. Turning to when further surveys are required, obviously the information that's required from applicants is required there to actually allow the planning authority to make planning decisions in light of their legal duties and the planning policies, both nationally and locally. The level information or surveys should be proportionate to the predicted risk to biodiversity and to nature and scale of the proposed development. That's highlighted by the British standard. And the decision maker can only request supporting information that is relevant, necessary, and material to the application in question. So it's about being robust, but at the same time being proportionate to what application you got before you. So put a photo on the right there showing a well-worn badger track crossing a site. In that case, clearly there's evidence of badger on the site, so we do would need a badger survey to be undertaken and information provided with the application. And these surveys also will be needed to inform both the statutory process if we've got these more significant developments regarding EIA and HRA, also to assess the impacts on national and local sites, priority habitats and species, and protected species as well. And generally, having done your initial surveys, your extended phase 1, your preliminary ecological assessment, would have identified the need for further surveys probably on most sites. And that would be to examine more detailed in terms of the use of the site by either protected or priority species, or if there's a particularly ecologically rich habitat, be it woodland or unimproved grassland, there'd be a clear need for botanical surveys. And sometimes these additional surveys are termed phase 2 surveys. When I used to work in the local planning authority, we tried to provide advice to our planning colleagues of when these additional surveys are required and what should be sort of the triggers for when they are actually needed. So ourselves and many other local planning ecologists provide checklists or flow charts to actually guide the planners to help them understand the process. Just an aid memoir, really. If they are having those pre-applications discussions, this might help focus the mind on when and what type of surveys are required. This isn't the full flow chart, but it just helps people understand what the triggers now. See, if you've got a building, then clearly the need to consider the issues on bats. The pond within 250 meters of a site, obviously, you know, there should probably be a need for some sort of great question due to amphibian surveys. The commonly asked question is when a survey is up to date. Again, this useful document has been produced by CIEEM, which explores, you know, the timescale of when survey reports are most likely to be valid. So anything less than 12 months is likely to be valid in most cases. Anything in the periods of 12 to 18 months is probably going to be okay, except where you've got mobile species. So if you've already got evidence of badgers, or say bats on your site, their use may vary, you know, throughout a year or across 18 months or so. But it's probably worth asking for an update survey if your survey is in that sort of 12 to 18 month period, really. Anything more than 18 months old, you know, time's marching on there and conditions on the site can change, the management of the site can change, and that can impact on which species can be present. So, you know, once you're into that sort of period, you're really probably asking for almost a full update survey of the site. Anything more than 3 years old is unlikely to be valid, and it's probably time for a complete fresh assessment by an ecologist. Obviously, there are, you know, the statutory requirements to consider protected species. You know, the presence of a material consideration in consideration of planning applications. Or in Scotland, actually, it's just the potential presence of legally protected species, an important consideration in decisions and planning. So just a scenario here, which, you know, planners often get, will be a barn conversion scheme. Bit of a scenario. So if we had a planning permission that was issued in 2016 and now expired, it's not gone forward for whatever reason, and the bat survey that accompanied that original permission was dated 2016. How many of you now think that report would be acceptable to support a fresh application in September 2020? So again, we should have a poll chance here, just to see how many of you think it would be acceptable to allow that 2016 report to support a fresh application. So, Christy, if you're going to run the poll. So whilst that's doing its calculations, etc. Obviously, September's always difficult, and if you've got someone to submit an application now for such a development, you know, we literally got for 2 weeks to try and get a bat survey in, allowing for, you know, if the weather's suitable. But when you've got a range of barns, one survey probably not going to be enough anyway, and you'll probably be looking realistically, if you had to do possibly something this year, but realistically, you're more likely to have to run further surveys in starting in May next year. So you might ask the applicant to withdraw the application or just let it sit on the books, depending on what the stance is within your authority. So, yeah, so most people here, 97%, say that the report wouldn't be acceptable in this situation. Obviously, the use of a barn by bats can vary enormously, even within a year, you know, between summer and winter. For every 3-year period, things can change. Roosts do come and go. And also the other thing, species can also use barns in the intervening period. You know, barn owl could suddenly use it up at the nesting site, so it's quite useful to get up-to-date information. And there are very strict legal compliance requirements for local planning authorities regarding European protected species. So that covers all species of bats, great-crested newts, otters, dormice. Scotland have the added advantage or interest of beaver and wildcat, also some rare plants. And all public bodies, including local planning authorities, have regard to the Habitats Directive when carrying out their functions, i.e. when considering planning applications. And the local planning authority needs to consider in detail if a development could give rise to a breach of the habitat regulations, i.e. an offence to the species. Also needs to consider whether a licence to be required from the statutory nature organisation, i.e. is a licence required from NRW in Wales, Natural England, etc. And is one like to be issued? And then the LPA also needs to consider whether the 3 licensing tests and whether they're capable of being met by the application. These 3 tests are set out here. These are the same tests that the statutory nature conservation authorities will also consider when issuing licensing, but planning has to do it first of all as well. First test is whether the development is in the interest of public health and public safety, so a new school, new hospital, that's fairly obvious, or for other imperative reasons of overriding public interest, including those of a social or economic nature and beneficial consequences of primarily important for the environment. So imperative, I've underlined and highlighted that, you know, is there an urgent need or reason for the development? And is it overriding, i.e. with the development that could cause harm to, say, a small pistol roost, is that the scale of development result from converting that barn, is that acceptable given the limited impact on, you know, a very small population of bats, for instance? Second test is we'll consider whether any satisfactory alternatives. You know, can the proposed development be sited in a different location? Can it be designed differently to avoid impacts? Are there any different timings of the works, again, to avoid any impacts on the species in question? We did have one scenario or application a few years ago when I worked in the planning authority where it was, I think, 100 houses application, and we actually were able to refuse that application by demonstrating there were satisfactory alternatives. So actually used the test, part of the reason for refusal, because the development was part of a town which had a neighbourhood plan, and we were able to demonstrate there were other identified and allocated sites within that neighbourhood plan with less impact on newts. And the inspector actually accepted our arguments for that. The third test, which is the sort of true ecological test, is whether the derogation is not detrimental to the maintenance of the population of the species, i.e. bats, newts, and a favourable conservation status in the natural range. So that's where we really need a level of information that clearly sets out what the impacts on the European protected species are, what are the proposed mitigation measures or compensation measures to offset the harm, how they're going to be delivered, and can they be secured through planning either by condition or legal agreement. And turning to some circumstances when surveys perhaps aren't always required. I mean, in some situations, survey data may already be available from, if you've got an application that's next door to a previous one, you know, the same 12 months, and they've already surveyed same ponds, well, there's sufficiently good information there to rely on for the next application, where the outcomes of the survey can be reasonably predicted and make no material difference. Again, if you've got a small development and there's a loss of a few conifer trees, and you know there's a potential again for breeding birds, obviously asking for surveys in that instance is probably not defensible, and it's not going to make any material difference. Obviously put a breeding bird condition on, and for the loss of those trees which may support breeding birds, if we can ensure that some bird boxes are incorporated into the development. In other places, alternative approaches have been adopted, which means that some developers no longer have to actually undertake their own surveys. Certainly happening in England now. We got Great Christian district level licensing being run by Natural England, or in the Central Midlands you've got Naturescape, where they've actually undertaken a proportionate approach to Great Christian surveys and use that information to model where both nuisance presence and likely impacts. And if you go through that route and make the conservation payments, there's no actual need to undertake your own surveys. Although it's probably all the wise developers to do that initial scoping in the first place to identify, well, are there any newts on the site or adjacent which may be impacted before we actually enter into an arrangement with Natural England or Naturescape. And a similar process is available in some of the newt special areas conservation around Buckley in North East Wales, where again there's been long-term systematic surveys of ponds both within the SAC and adjacent to it. So both Natural Resources Wales and Flintshire and Wrexham both have pretty good understanding of newt populations around those sites. And therefore, when developments come forward with potential impacts, they may not always ask for actual additional new surveys. Obviously, with the policy drive for providing biodiversity net gain, it's important that information is now provided to actually demonstrate those losses and gains. I always just get slightly annoyed of having to measure hedgerows to work out whether there was a net gain, and we increasingly asked applicants to provide just a very simple table on this, which often meant ensuring that both any plans between landscaping, ARB and ecology all lined up to give the same story, really. So at a minimum, a useful table should be provided to help demonstrate that. Obviously, increasingly across England, there's a use of biodiversity net gain matrices. Nationally, obviously, the DEFRA version 2 is being rolled out. I think some people are still using the Warwickshire version as well. Obviously, potentially this can be mandatory in hopefully the next 6 to 9 months, really. There's a lot of information to be collected there on the habitats, condition assessments to inform whether there is actually a net gain. Some other authorities understand also ask for actually plans showing where these impacts are, and that basically, and also where enhancements are going to be actually delivered, so it's actually visually prominent. So hopefully, with all this information that's provided by ecological surveys and reports, the decisions which planners can make are fair, transparent, and legally sound. They can comply with both the statutory obligations, such as the habitat regs and policy requirements, with a reduced likelihood of legal challenge, judicial review, which obviously has led to case law, and the need for protected species surveys to be undertaken to be reiterated by sort of Cheshire East case, another one subsequently, and also with the actual calculations or information being provided and what net gains have been provided as part of the local plan annual monitoring reports, those net gains can be provided, so the local plan authority can actually demonstrate that net gains are being achieved. So a bit of a run through on what information is required by planning in terms of ecology, in determining planning of applications. We will get into the level of detail of when reports are fit for purposes and things to look out for in the next webinar. But for now, I'm happy to take questions. So, Christy, if you're open to collect those.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Alan. Yes, so we've had a few questions come in. One from Louisa. Does this information apply across the whole of the UK, or are there differences?
Well, certainly the need to provide surveys as a material consideration is applied throughout the devolved administrations. Obviously, things like net gain have an increased focus in England, but understanding Scotland certainly have to update their planning policies nationally. I think there will be a driver there. And biodiversity enhancement has been around for a few years. Certainly, it's also been applicable in Wales. And certainly there was a briefing note issued by, I think, the chief planner in Wales, setting out that biodiversity enhancement net gain should be provided with developments. And if it wasn't provided, that would be a consideration to be taken into account in determining applications. So the weight attached to it has increased over recent years.
Great, thank you. Question here from Samantha. Is it not preferable for phase 2 surveys to be incorporated into the final ECIA to ensure a thorough and detailed assessment of impacts and mitigation strategy?
The answer to that, clearly yes, that should always be the case, but I think it does vary on the scale of that application that's before you. And certainly in an ideal world that should be undertaken, but we don't always live in an ideal world, and many applications do come in with piecemeal information. And having been working in the local planning authority, sometimes it is a detective story, shall we say, to ensure we've got all the relevant pieces of information and plans, and they all link up with the landscape drawings to ensure we've got the correct picture. I wouldn't suggest that we got everything we wanted in all cases at the same time. It obviously is the case for larger developments when you want into environmental impact assessment, etc.
Thank you. Somebody's asked if they could have PDF copies of things like the flowchart. Is it possible to provide that?
I haven't got an electronic version. I had to scan that in. So I've worked in consultancy for 12 months, and all my previous stuff is stuck on an old laptop, unfortunately. But you can obviously see what's on the slide there and adapt it, because obviously that one was the one we did for my previous colleagues. So and other ones are available online.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just to note, we've recorded this session, so it'll be available later on if you want to rewatch. Okay, so a question from Robert. I'm learning about the role, so have no context here. Is the project lifecycle for planning usually based on a waterfall approach, or is there any appetite to explore using agile methods of project management?
Can you just repeat that question again, so I should make sure I fully understood it?
Yeah, so I'm learning about the role, so have no context here. Is the project lifecycle for planning usually on a waterfall approach, or is there any appetite to explore using agile methods of project management?
Sounds more of a general question. I don't think I can answer that particularly. Obviously, it depends on the client. If you're working for a developer, obviously they'll probably usually have a very specific project plan and timescales attached to that. So if you are advising your clients on what surveys are needed, obviously you need to ensure that they factored in those seasonal restrictions for some surveys to ensure that their project plan can be delivered within the timescales that they're hoping to.
That's great, thank you. Okay, so a question here, small application conversions or extensions in suburban area. PA flagged up suitability for reptiles. Applicant wants surveys and mitigation if found to be conditioned, i.e. do not do surveys before application. Is this acceptable?
No, in short, really, because you can't really condition. Well, first of all, there's obviously clear case law that says you need to have this information up front. And it's also very difficult if you're conditioning that survey and a mitigation, and subsequently you find, say, a significant populations or slow worms. How are you actually going to provide that compensation on site if you're already, intending to build over most of it? Really, trying to retrofit is very difficult. And there's been at least one planning inspector institution I've seen where that he said you couldn't use gardens for mitigation and compensation, which is probably quite right, really, because you've got no control over it. Once that house is sold to an occupier, you've got no real control over ensuring that any sort of suitable habitat is still provided in that garden. So yeah, no, survey should always be undertaken up front, so everyone's clear about what the impacts are on that species, and therefore allowance or incorporation of the impacts can be allowed.
Thank you, Alan. Question here from Louise. Are phase 1 habitat surveys not being replaced by UK habitat classification surveys?
Yes, there's certainly a trend towards that, especially to link in with biodiversity net gain. At the company, we are sort of doing a combination of both at the moment, but whether that, long term there will be a full transition to the habitats role, we'll have to wait and see.
Great, thank you. Do you know what proportion of planning authorities have an in-house ecologist or in-house biodiversity officer advising the planners?
Now, I think if I'm correct, the last survey that was nationally undertaken was, I think it was about 2013, I think it was, undertaken by the Association of Local Government Ecologists. And I think then only about 1 in 3 or 33% of local planning authorities had in-house advice. Obviously, in the last decade, you've seen local authority budgets cut quite severely. Even my own authority, when I was working there, we were under a lot of pressure, and we were 2 people trying to do, I don't know, up to about 850 planning applications comments per year, and things were tight. But in the last, say, 6 months, I think certainly within England, I think things have turned around slightly, because obviously the requirement to have that specialist knowledge, especially with biodiversity net gain on the horizon, where you can't expect planners to know all technical disciplines inside out, and there is a very good justification and need to have that expert technical knowledge in house now. I mean, it doesn't always have to be in house. Some planning authorities rely on outside bodies. Like certainly in the northwest, the Greater Manchester Ecological Unit does provide an advisory role to authorities outside Manchester, through a paid service, where perhaps other authorities in Lancashire feel they can't fully commit to a full-time post, but by having on hand that advisory service from GMEU, they can still ensure that biodiversity is considered and they apply their legal duties.
Thank you, Alan. Claire says, you mentioned beavers being European protected species in Scotland. With beavers being gradually reintroduced in parts of England, I assume surveys will be required for the rest of the UK where beaver reintroduction is happening. Yeah,
I mean, I think that certainly could be the case. Obviously, we're in a sort of slightly unknown territory here. Obviously, they'd have to be in their natural range, I think. So the initial trial periods, I don't think you could consider them, but once the beavers are established or populations are established in their natural range, then potentially, yes, they could be considered European protected species. So, down in Devon, obviously, I think the population is quite well established now there. Elsewhere, I think we're still in trials. But added to the complication of that is the whole, post-Brexit landscape of species protection, really. So we'll have to watch this space.
Thank you. Question here, if the ECIA identifies clear and effective mitigation, would that justify loss of, say, a section of woodland?
It may justify it, but it still has to be compensated to ensure no net loss. And, as policy has gone to the net gain, so, if there is a loss, it still would have to be compensated for and provided on or off site. So, yeah, it still would allow it, but the impacts still need to be addressed. Obviously, one exception would obviously be ancient woodland, where obviously the MPPF quite strong on its retention. Sorry, Christy.
No, that's fine, thank you. So a question here which I may be able to answer. I consistently find CIEEM members not following survey guidelines. For example, initial survey finds backdroppings, site needs backed emergent surveys. They've done a further visit, sent in a letter mentioning statistics being used, DNA analysis confirms BLE, and that's it, no reference to guidance. Why is it not being followed? And how does CIEEM address this from its members? So yeah, it is possible to lodge a complaint against another CIEEM member that you feel isn't carrying out the best practice. And you can do that by emailing complaints@ciem.net and discuss further with them. So yeah, we do have a process and a procedure for when people aren't following the best practice.
Yeah, that's probably something we'll get into a bit more detail in the next webinar as well, really, into that, whether survey reports are fit for purpose or when surveys haven't been undertaken in line with best practice. And there's plenty of best practice out there people should be following. And sometimes people quote, using professional judgment, it was decided not to take further surveys. Well, I think increasingly that can't be relied upon, really, but we'll get onto that in the next webinar.
Great, thank you. Laura's asked, do you think the planning reform proposed in the white paper currently out for consultation could be good news for biodiversity, or is it paving the way for development at all costs?
Yes, obviously, the white paper only relates to England. Obviously, this audience is for the whole of the UK, but in England, yeah, who knows what's going to happen? Obviously, there have been, noises from government. They want to promote the natural environment, etc. But on the other hand, mute counting has been mentioned by the Prime Minister. So yeah, I think again, it's just watch your space. Really, it's very difficult to actually work out where it's going to go. But obviously, there has been a drive in the last 12, 18 months, certainly with regards, approaches to Great Christian Utes and district level licensing. I understand Natural England also looking at bats. So if you do sort of follow that sort of drive or trajectory, you can see that they obviously are trying to make things simpler, but whether they'll remove it entirely, it's difficult to know.
Great, thank you. Nancy asks, is it possible to protect habitat that is used for foraging and commuting, but not for roosting and nesting?
In terms of protecting, obviously, if you can demonstrate that that hedgerow leading from the barns to the wider countryside is very important for commuting for, say, less a horseshoe population, I think you should be able to, rely on published papers and advice and Innocent Wildlife Trust to demonstrate those important linkages, and should be, pushing for their retention. And certainly that's one thing we wish to do. It's just not about just the habitat or roost replacement. It's whether there's suitable foraging commuting habitat in the wild landscape. And certainly with regards to birds, it depends on what scale of impact you're looking at. Obviously, if you've got development close to SPA, estuaries, obviously you might be in the remit of functionally linked land that's used for foraging or roosting by migratory flocks, and therefore there is a clear presumption for protection, or if it can't be retained, obviously for alternatives to be provided.
Great, thank you. Okay, just, yeah, we don't have long. We've got quite a few questions. I'm just gonna try and pick one. Who would monitor mitigation and/or compensation effectiveness after the development is complete and is in use every day? Does this happen much?
Depends on the scale of development, really. The larger ones will certainly you have some sort of post-construction monitoring, and sometimes a liaison committee or management group that meets regularly. I've been involved with sort of groups that have met quarterly with regards to, say, mitigation that's provided for wind farms, where ongoing monitoring of both bird use and bat use, and on both the existing site and the compensation habitat has been provided. It is obviously more difficult than the large number of smaller applications. Going back years, Natural or English Nature probably used to do a lot more monitoring in terms of EPS licenses, but unfortunately I don't think the resources are there anymore to do that monitoring. But increasingly I think more members of the public are aware, and obviously they will flag up issues to local planning authorities that you might consider that enforcement action is required if they feel that mitigation isn't being maintained or is being affected by further development. And obviously I think turning into sort of the biodiversity net gain territory, where perhaps habitat's been provided off-site, people like the Environment Bank certainly incorporate an element of monitoring into the schemes that they provide over, say, 5 or 10 year period. Obviously, I think with biodiversity net gain becomes mandatory in England, I think people will be looking at trying to secure habitat creation and management and monitoring for up to a 30-year period.
Thank you, Alan. Mike asks, how important do you think it is that all planning officers should receive basic biodiversity training?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I've never expected my former colleagues to know everything. I think it's impossible they know everything, but they should at least have a basic understanding. Yeah, we used to provide regular sessions to our planners on biodiversity, so at least they had understood the basics. And on occasions, a few of them ran with it. I think depends on the interest of the planning officer in question, but everyone should have a basic understanding. You know, that going back, it is material consideration, and they may be questioned both by their senior colleagues or consultees or elected members if it goes to committee, so they should be able to answer at least the basic questions.
Thank you. Louise asks, mention of being able to use existing survey data from an adjacent site. This information needs to be gathered, stored and made available by local record centres, but this may not always be gathered quickly enough to remain valid. Some LPAs did not collect ecological data due to data ownership issues. Is all ecological data submitted with an application not effectively in the public domain?
Yeah, it's the trend that you're aware of it, really. I mean, again, increasingly drive for online resources, and many planning authorities now have their applications online with a searchable mapping function. Therefore, I increasingly do check if I'm advising a client on a site, what other developments have gone on in the vicinity, to see whether other surveys have been undertaken, because there is sometimes a lag time between when survey is undertaken and whether it's submitted to the local record centre. And unfortunately, not all data does end up in local record centres as well. So I usually myself operate a twin track approach of both formally going to the local record centre, also have a quick search on the planning authority planning website just to see what else is out there. Because sometimes you do find some very useful information.
Thank you. Question here, who is licensed to carry out ECIA?
There's no one actually licensed to carry it out. Obviously, there are guidelines which CIEEM members should follow, but there's no formal licensing regime to say you are actually following them per se.
Great, thank you. How recent / close should ecological information be to trigger a PEA or ECIA? For example, 1,985 lizard record 100 metres away.
Was there a date there as well, or was it just that distance?
Oh, was that a date? Sorry. 1985 lizard record 100 metres away.
Yeah, once you get sort of more than 10 years old, then I think you can say it's probably historic, really. And that is a general issue with the records. They are, records in a particular time by a particular person, and they don't always prove absence. They are records of that species being present on that day. Just because they weren't there on another day and there's no record doesn't mean they're not there now. Particularly badgers are very good at turning up and moving around the countryside and urban areas. I worked in Chester, and I was convinced that badgers had worked out the badger cull was on, and they increasingly were found right in the inner city and under people's garden sheds. So yeah, they were there one year and disappeared the next. So yeah, and most data more than 10 years old will be historic, really.
Great, thank you. James asks, is biodiversity net gain the be-all and end-all for mitigation? For example, is it acceptable to cut down a large number of oak trees and replace them with a half a dozen trees from different species? Or can you bring in wider ecological concerns when assessing mitigation?
I think it's always important to try and first of all retain things on site, so you've got mature trees, and the timescale is factored into formal biodiversity net gain calculation. For certain habitats, it's going to take a long time to replace them, so that factor is accounted for. If you're losing a bit of woodland, a few whips in tree guards is not going to look anything like a woodland until at least 15 years. So, and to get to mature oaks, we're talking hundreds of years, really. So, always try and push for retention in the first place, really. Obviously, there may be other information that's useful. Obviously, if a tree or arb survey has been undertaken and it's demonstrated that that tree is unsafe or is likely to fail in future years, that may also inform whether you think actually is it worth trying to push for its retention in the first place.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that we're coming up to 1 o'clock, but we did start 5 minutes late. Are you happy to carry on to 5 o'clock?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Perfect, thank you. So Amanda asks, can you provide details of the case law that you mentioned, RE gardens not being suitable for mitigation?
I'll have to do some digging. It was a planning inspector report on a particular site. I'll have a look whether I've still got a copy. Unfortunately, when I worked in the local planning authority, I had all that information to hand. Now I've got a slightly different role with the consultancy. I don't have everything, all my former records to hand. So I'll see what I can do. I can't promise, but it certainly was that one inspector's report.
No problem, thank you. Question here, does condition assessment of watercourses, the net gain, have to be carried out by an accredited surveyor, and what constitutes accreditation?
I'm not aware that anyone who has to undertake biodiversity net gain calculations has to be accredited per se. Some people might be aware otherwise, but obviously, ideally, anyone who undertakes should have appropriate training and have relevant competencies, and obviously the CIEEM members, that training and competencies are very much endorsed, and it's a requirement. People are relatively skilled up to undertake the work they're underdoing. But I'm not aware that particular net gain calculations regarding watercourses there was an accreditation requirement. But that may come, who knows? It may be easier, if there are people accredited to undertake certain types of surveys, then there is a level of competency acknowledged, and therefore, the product should be up for the job.
Great, thank you. Joseph asks, a nearby development plan to expand a building has just been submitted. The application stated there was not much biodiversity / nothing protected nearby. It's 50 metres from a woodland with many bat records, etc. Legally, they must at least have to run some bat surveys.
It gets more difficult for foraging and commuting habitat, really. It depends on what, obviously I don't know what the habitat is, whether this development it is, and also depends on what the impacts are. If the boundaries of that site, be the hedgerows, are being retained, there's probably less need for actually foraging commuting habitat surveys to be undertaken, really. But yeah, without having the details before me, it's difficult to say, really. Something like within 50 metres of woodland, you probably would be expecting people to think about badgers as well, really. And it could also be a local wildlife site where there could be indirect impacts, changes in hydrology, runoff, etc. So yeah, ecological surveys and appraisal should be undertaken in the first place, really, I think, in that scenario. But sometimes things do also, unfortunately, do fall between the cracks, shall we say. I've certainly seen scenarios where developments close to local wildlife sites haven't been submitted with a ecological survey, and we weren't consulted as local planning ecologists. I think it's planner just forgot or oversight, and they issued a decision. So these things shouldn't happen, but we can't be 100% of all the time, unfortunately.
Thank you, Alan. So we're approaching 5 past, so if we just take one more question. Can you confirm what stage in the planning process a PEA should be provided compared to the phase 2 survey?
Well, the PEA really, that's the initial, almost early doors scoping to inform the project, really. And if it is submitted with a planning application, it's unlikely to have that sufficient analysis of the impacts of the development, and may also require additional surveys to be undertaken. Sometimes you will see applicants just submit that PEA and they forget about the rest of the ecology until the planning officer or the local government ecologist picks up the fact that additional surveys are needed, and then have to go back and say, well, hang on, where are the other surveys? So a PEA on its own is unlikely to be sufficient unless there are no direct impacts.
That's great, thank you, Ellen. I think we'll stop there for the questions. So yeah, a massive thank you, Alan, for presenting today, and thank you to everyone for joining and for asking your questions. Just a few things to note. So you do have registered practices, and our vision is for our 2 professions to work more closely together to promote sustainable land use and development. And we cannot expect planners to be experts in everything, and by supporting each other, we can deliver better outcomes for the natural environment. So if you need experienced specialist help to support your development projects, please check out our registered practices, as they are champions of delivering the best outcomes for biodiversity whilst supporting successful development. And yeah, further information on our registered practices can be found on our website. And yeah, finally, just to let you all know, the third webinar of this series, knowing when ecological reports are fit for purpose, will be taking place on the 24th of September. So please do sign up to that via the same website. Yes, and I think that's everything from me. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed it. Found it useful.
Yes, yeah, I'll send out a feedback survey later today, and a recording of the webinar will be available on our website later this afternoon. So yeah, we'll end the webinar there. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks now. Goodbye.